If we're going from the date the elves awakened to the last recorded date in the Fourth Age, Tolkien's timeline is immense, lasting for 11,584 years. And if we want to add in the years before the awakening of the elves, it lasts for tens of thousands of years longer, although this is kind of cheating because not much actually happens. But what if I told you that Tolkien wasn't actually that happy with his timeline and at one point wanted to change it enormously? In this video, we look at how Tolkien seriously considered revising his timeline. In 1960, Tolkien wrote 6 pages that detailed some of his issues with the timeline, specifically the timeline of the First Age during the so-called Years of the Trees. Now, if you look at the timeline of the Years of the Trees, the dates given aren't separated by regular solar years, as the sun and moon did not exist at that time. Instead, they're represented by Valian years. And at the time the original timeline was being created, one Valian year was roughly equal to around 9 to 10 solar years. So, for example, when Melkor was imprisoned by the Valar, he was imprisoned for 300 Valian years, which was the equivalent of roughly 3,000 solar years. The entire timeline before the first rising of the sun works off this assumption, but Tolkien had some issues with it later on. The first reference to this appears in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, where an Elven year, which is another word for a Valian year, was stated as being equal to 144 regular years. To be fair, this has a minimal impact on the story of The Lord of the Rings, but it has a huge impact on the broader world building and timeline of Middle-earth, and it solves some problems, but obviously creates some new ones. So, why did Tolkien make this change? Well, simply put, he believed that the original timeline was impossible, stating that the timeline was too short and that some events could not have actually happened when they did. His first problem was in regards to the elves. 144 awaken, but 35 Valian years later, or 350 regular years, Orome finds them and finds them in large numbers, we're talking thousands. Tolkien believed it wasn't possible for the elves to have grown in number that quickly, especially considering that he had already devised elven life cycles in which they would have children. Basically, Tolkien's own timeline broke Tolkien's own rules. But it wasn't just the awakening of the elves that Tolkien found unrealistic. He also found the awakening of men unrealistic. In the actual timeline, men awakened with the first rising of the sun in the year 0 of the First Age, and like elves, they are few in number. But 310 years later, men now span the entire continent of Middle-earth in large numbers and are already deeply sundered in languages and appearance. Tolkien wrote in his note, "all that in 310 years" with an exclamation mark, and also marked down the note as important. So yeah, he felt strongly about this. Another smaller issue Tolkien had was how quickly Morgoth got his war machine running when he returned to Middle-earth. From his return to his first assaults on Beleriand, it was only 2 Valian years, or 20 solar years. However, Tolkien was able to solve this problem regardless of the timeline. He just decided that Angband had already existed, wasn't totally destroyed, and that Sauron and the Balrogs had already gotten a head start on rallying Morgoth's old forces. Okay, so how did Tolkien decide to get around the so-called impossible timeline? Well, I mentioned earlier that Tolkien wrote down the number 144 solar years as the new number for a Valian year, and that's the solution he went with, massively increasing the length of the timeline and shifting around some of the dates to fit with it. This allowed both elves and men a reasonable amount of time to grow in number, and in the case of the latter, develop differently and spread across the continent. I'll of course go into detail. In the original timeline, the elves awoke in 1050 of the Years of the Trees, but Tolkien decided to shift this to 1000. The elves were originally discovered by Orome in 1085, but Tolkien decided that this date should be shifted slightly to 1090. Don't let this seemingly short gap deceive you though. With Tolkien's new version of a Valian year, these two dates would be separated by 12,960 solar years, which is longer than the entire original timeline. Men received an even larger change. Originally awakening in the year 0 of the First Age, Tolkien decided that men should awaken far closer to the awakening of the elves, and he ended up having 2 ideas with this. The first idea was that men should awaken around 1100 of the Years of the Trees, and the second idea was that men should awaken sometime between 1075 to 1080. The obvious difference here is that this change would mean that men existed for far longer. In fact, Tolkien did the maths and worked out that by 310 of the First Age, men had existed for 57,334 years. Unfortunately, his maths was wrong, and Carl F. Hofstadter corrected it to 57,190 years. There's actually a huge difference between these dates as well. If men awoke at the latter date of around 1100, they would have awoken shortly after Morgoth was taken captive, and only would have shared Middle-earth with all of the elves for a short amount of time, relatively speaking. But at the earlier date, men would have existed while Morgoth was still active in Utumno, and they would have shared Middle-earth with all of the elves for a significantly longer period of time, around 3,600 years. Interestingly enough, Tolkien says that men and elves still would not have met at this time, saying that Cuiviénen and Hildorian must have still been very far from each other. Another important distinction between the dates is how men would have been corrupted. The earlier date means that men were corrupted directly by Morgoth as they were in the original timeline, but of course, many years later. It also means that men just straight up got ignored by the Valar, who were more focused on saving the elves and seemingly didn't care if men got corrupted. The latter date means that Morgoth could not have corrupted men as he was imprisoned, and instead, it was done by Sauron. Thematically, this kind of fits with Sauron. In the myth of men's corruption, Morgoth is described as the giver of gifts, the same name Sauron uses when he's forging the Rings of Power. If you're a little confused by this point, let me summarize. Tolkien believed his original timeline was impossible because the lengths of time were too short, and didn't support things like the growth of elves and men. To fix this, he drastically increased the length of the timeline by tens of thousands of years, and moved some dates around, mostly for men, to fit in with the new lengthened timeline. This of course created some other issues. You can't just extend the timeline by tens of thousands of years, and move around important dates without having to change or explain other things. I've already actually touched on some of the issues. For example, the interesting scenario where elves, Morgoth in Utumno, and men all could have existed in Middle-earth at the same time. It raises the questions, why did men and elves not meet earlier? Why did the Valar save the elves but ignore men? Tolkien basically used the same answer for both questions. Middle-earth is really big, therefore both the elves and the Valar did not find men until much later, after Morgoth had already found them. Sure, it works as an answer, but given the lengths of time involved, now thousands of years, I would say it's a little bit not satisfying. Another problem that Tolkien encountered was how the timeline change affected the aging of elves. At this point in time, Tolkien was really into trying to relate the lifespan of an elf to a lifespan of a man, but given he had already written most of the story and the timeline, his attempts at explaining basically boiled down to elves age differently at different times and in different places, sometimes for no real reason. And he did the same here, explaining that elves aged much slower in the early years. So yes, the timeline change would make Círdan like 60,000 years old, but he was actually technically younger because elves aged differently back then. One issue that Tolkien didn't touch on was how to fill the vast history between Morgoth's captivity and Morgoth's return. If elves, men, and dwarves existed for tens of thousands of years longer than they did, the years of the trees in the First Age in general must have had a lot going on. And specifically for men, that's a lot of time for advancement. Yet, at the start of the Second Age, the men of Middle-earth are still fairly primitive. You might say, but hold on, in real life, humanity spent forever in the Stone Age. But men on Arda awoke at a level above the Stone Age, so the comparison doesn't really work. And yet another issue is that certain events take a comically long time if Valyrian years are lengthened. For example, it would have taken 700 years for the Noldor to reach Middle-earth after rebelling against the Valar, instead of the much more sensible 50 years it actually takes. Another event is the captivity of Maedhros. In the actual timeline, it lasts for somewhere between 22 to 32 years, which is still a really long time to be chained to a side of a mountain, but with Tolkien's proposed changes, that would become nearly 300 years, which is kind of unbelievable, and it's surprising that Maedhros didn't return completely insane. There's a host of other smaller issues too, and I think that's the main reason why Tolkien's proposed changes never made it beyond the conceptual stage. Because remember, Tolkien lived for another 13 years after these notes were written. That's enough time to make some pretty hefty changes. Of course, if you're not rewriting Galadriel and Celeborn for the 92nd time. But a change to the timeline of this magnitude, even if it doesn't really affect the Second or Third Age that much, still would have required large rewrites of the Silmarillion, because otherwise it's completely incompatible with most of his other work. So yeah, even though there were really cool ideas in these notes, most of what Tolkien said in them just doesn't really fit in with the rest of what he wrote. And although canon is a divisive topic in the Tolkien community, I think you can safely say that changes like this don't really fit in with any popular conception of the canon. That said, they're an interesting glimpse into changes that Tolkien could have made had he been dedicated to making them. It's also an interesting glimpse into how Tolkien, in his later years, was still unhappy with much of what he had written. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, if Tolkien were somehow still alive today, I think he would still be making constant changes to his Legendarium, even if everyone else thought it was fine. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want to find these notes, it's written in the Awakening of the Quendi in Nature of Middle-earth, which contains a lot of interesting concepts like this, some of which, I have to admit, are too much, and holy shit I'm glad Tolkien never found a way to properly insert them into the story. Let's just say, Tolkien got way more scientific in his later years, and some of the stuff reminds me of midichlorians from Star Wars, which everyone loves. Cheers, farewell, and remember, in this version of Middle-earth, Círdan was a virgin for 60,000 years.